anything used for a military purpose can be targeted. Any Hamas operative can be targeted, even if they're amongst civilians. And this is absolutely clear in international law. Everything Israel is doing now is dedicated to the protection of civilians.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. We're continuing our JNS coverage of the war on Israel that was launched by Hamas on October 7th with a conversation with Eugene Kontorovich, one of the world's experts on international law and the Middle East conflict. But first, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, you can see us on Telegram. You can find the latest news, including Top Story and other JNS TV content there by subscribing. And now to today's program. The world is obsessed with a tragedy in the Middle East, and people are marching and pushing their governments to do something about it. But what's interesting about the global movement of concern is what doesn't interest those who are part of it. They're not angry about the Hamas terrorist group's decision to launch a war against Israel on October 7th with a massive assault on Israeli communities in southern Israel, in which 1,400 men, women, and children, including entire families, were murdered, thousands wounded, and more than 200 were kidnapped. These pogroms, in which people of all ages, including children, were tortured, women were raped, and the bodies of the dead were desecrated, constituted the worst mass slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, and were indeed reminiscent of the crimes of the Nazis in terms of the sadism and deliberate cruelty inflicted on the victims. But the perpetrators of these horrific crimes knew something about international opinion that perhaps many enlightened liberals didn't. Rather than generating a massive backlash against a Palestinian national movement that valorizes and honors such terrorism, the events of October 7th did just the opposite. It triggered a surge in anti-Semitism around the globe. Ostensibly, the cause of this surge is the crisis that everybody cares about, the plight of Palestinian Arabs living in Gaza, as Israeli forces seek to destroy the Hamas terrorist group that attacked their country. Nor is this a case where sympathy is being doled out to all of the victims of the war. The mobs marching in the world's largest cities and on college campuses to protest the situation are solely interested in backing the Palestinians. They echo the rhetoric of the terrorists in calling for the elimination of Israel and the genocide of its people. They mock the suffering of Jews and declare the terrorist crimes to be justified because it is the effort of an occupied people to overthrow their oppressors. Except, of course, Gaza isn't occupied, and no Jew has lived there since 2005. And if a Palestinian state was the issue, the Palestinian Arabs could have had one decades ago. The fact that they have consistently rejected peace is excused because the intersectional left has educated a generation of Westerners to believe that Israel has no right to exist, no matter where its borders are drawn. It's not just that Jewish suffering is erased, but that it is considered justified. It's no longer possible to pretend that what is motivating the marchers is humanitarian concerns. As we continue to see with the video from each demonstration or confrontation, or the spectacle of activists tearing down posters with the pictures of Israeli hostages, this is raw, unadulterated anti-Semitism. Yet the key question in the fourth week of this war of survival for Israel, as its troops have entered Gaza to root out the terrorists, is why the arguments of the anti-Semites are resonating even with governments like that of the United States, which ostensibly support Israel. Why have they pressured Israel to resupply the areas under Hamas control with commodities that will, as with all previous aid, be used by the terrorists, not ordinary people? Why is Israel, alone of all the nations, forced to ensure that the quality of life inside Hamas Gaza is maintained? Why is Israel, alone of all the nations, not allowed to take out enemies attacking its borders, but must instead treat them with kid gloves? Why is there such growing support to force a ceasefire on Israel to allow Hamas to emerge victorious from its crime spree? It's true that some sympathy for the residents of Gaza, as they pay the price for Hamas's war, is real and justified. But why isn't that sympathy manifested in demands to release the hostages and to surrender those responsible for the October 7th crimes so as to avoid more civilian losses? Why are Jewish rights as well as Jewish suffering erased, while a punitive Palestinian right to slaughter Jews in order to avenge past suffering that they brought on themselves by choosing war rather than peace and compromise is treated as legitimate? The answer isn't sympathy for victims as much as it is anti-Semitism as expressed in anti-Zionism and woke beliefs that seek to strip the Jews of legitimacy in much the same way that earlier generations of anti-Semites tried to do, albeit without engaging in the pretense that such advocacy has something to do with human rights. These are arguments that the vast majority of Americans reject, but they are deeply rooted in the chattering classes that make up the media, academia, the world of popular culture, and the Biden administration. The voices of the majority need to be heard, and what's more, liberal Jews, who are still recovering from their shock at being abandoned by their erstwhile minority allies on the left, need to speak up. In doing so, they should stop worrying about an international opinion that blames Jews for problems no matter what they've done or what the elites who run our leading institutions think. And they need to find the courage to label those calling for a free Palestine or justifying terror by their right names: anti-Semites. Those who don't, or who think they must virtue signal their concern for Palestinians in order to remain relevant or considered acceptable, aren't just missing the point. They are playing right into the hands of Jew haters who want them dead just as much as they wish for Israel's destruction. To discuss all this, as well as the implications of the war against Hamas in law and public diplomacy, we're pleased to have back with us today one of the world's leading experts in international law and on the Middle East conflict. Eugene Kontorovich is professor of law and director of the Center for the Middle East and International Law at the Antonin Scalia Law School of George Mason University, as well as one of the world's preeminent experts on universal jurisdiction and maritime piracy, as well as international law and the Israeli-Arab conflict. He is a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal's editorial pages, and his writing has also appeared in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Politico, Commentary Magazine, and numerous other publications. Eugene Kontorovich, welcome to Top Story.
Good to be here.
Well, Eugene, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about the issue that seems to be at the top of the international agenda, which isn't, of course, Hamas terrorism, but the impact of Israel's efforts to destroy the terrorists on Palestinian Arabs living in Gaza. What are Israel's obligations to the people of Gaza as it fights against the people who attacked the Jewish state on October 7th, according to international law, whatever international law means?
So under the international laws of war, which are mostly found in Geneva, the Geneva Conventions, and in some in customary law, the rules are pretty clear. Any military target is a valid target. So Israel can strike Hamas bunkers, weapons storage facilities, Hamas operatives, wherever they are. Israel can strike those targets. Now, under the laws of war, combatant, Hamas, is required to distinguish between its fighters and civilians. But of course, Hamas is an illegal terrorist organization that is not interested in doing that. So it co-locates its military facilities amongst civilians. Now, that is illegal in international law. But it also does not require Israel to not target Hamas, wherever they may be. whether they be under a hospital or in a mosque. Indeed, that would be an insane rule, because it would mean that you have an incentive that it's illegal to put your military facilities amongst civilians, but you get rewarded for doing so by being protected from attack. So, in fact, any military facility, anything used for a military purpose can be targeted. Any Hamas operative can be targeted, even if they're amongst civilians, and this is absolutely clear in international law. Now, it is also not illegal for civilians to be harmed in such attacks. There has never been a war fought without civilian casualties, and those casualties are not a war crime unless the civilians are deliberately targeted. So if Israel is going after a valid military target and there happen to be civilians there, that is not illegal. And indeed, America killed thousands of innocent Syrians fighting ISIS in Syria, maybe tens of thousands of Iraqis, and of course the Allies killed hundreds of thousands of innocent Germans in World War II. There's no other way to fight a war. The one restriction is that when a target is being attacked, you're required to consider whether the anticipated civilian harm, which you never really know in advance, but the estimate, is proportionate to the military advantage. Now, there is no ratio for this proportion. There's no number, there's no equation. It's a rule of thumb, which every country basically interprets for itself. But it means you can't take out a city block to take out one sniper. But in this case, the military advantage Israel is getting by taking out, for example, a group of Hamas fighters is not simply being able to maneuver with their tanks. It is freeing its cities from a genocidal threat. And in fact, it is the protection of civilians. So everything Israel is doing now is dedicated to the protection of civilians.
Yeah, I think that's very clear. And yet it has become a commonplace thing, certainly in Western discourse, to hear Israel accused of war crimes. I guess the question is, has it actually committed war crimes by striking at Hamas targets? And I guess your answer is no. But yet that still doesn't stop the Biden administration, which is generally supportive of Israel, at least more supportive than many thought it would be. So it's created this dynamic where even though the laws of war say one thing, the laws of broadcast news seem to say something else.
Well, as we've seen before in many contexts, like the idea of occupied territory, illegal settlements, international law has become a polite way of saying things that you can't say in regular terms. So to say, Israel should not collectively punish Gazans. Now, of course, a war with a country is not collective punishment, even though it always comes at a cost to the civilian population. Just like putting someone in jail for murder is not collective punishment of their children, even though they may be disadvantaged by losing their breadwinner. So international law is just a nice way of saying what would be horrible to put in direct words, which is Israel must subject itself to murderous, barbaric attacks and having thousands of its countrymen tortured to death without any effective recourse of preventing it. And it must pay this price just because it's a Jewish state. So you can't really say that. So instead you have to say, Israel, of course, is allowed to defend itself, and then rule out all actual possible methods of self-defense.
Yeah, well, obviously pressure to lessen the suffering of Palestinians living under Hamas rule has become part of the U.S. policy towards Israel. And I suppose the question is, can Prime Minister Netanyahu afford to ignore those warnings? Or is his political situation so precarious that he can't afford not to ignore them and has to go ahead and try to take out Hamas, as difficult as that may be?
I mean, obviously, the United States, President Biden is a balancing act, and his entire policy here can be understood as being completely reactive to his electoral concerns. He understands that now even the most liberal Jews are not going to vote for the Democrats if they keep Israel from protecting itself, that this is an existential war for Israel, and not allowing Israel to take out Hamas is essentially not allowing Israel to exist. So on one hand, he needs those votes. On the other hand, he's also afraid of losing his progressive base, his Arab voters. And the difficult situation for him is he needs them both to win what might be a very tight election. So this is why on one hand he says, Israel, we support Israel, he says very nice things. On the other hand, you have to provide electricity, water, internet connections, and allow supplies to go to Hamas. Right? The people who tortured your citizens to death, you now have to give them Wi-Fi.
Yeah, that was a major thing, a major feature in the New York Times this past weekend about the horror of 24 hours without Wi-Fi.
But that
in Gaza,
triangulation, that zigging and zagging is trying to navigate. He needs to be, seen as being pro-Israel, but perhaps, not in an unmodulated way, and that's explaining his reaction. So presumably the pressure placed on Israel to give in to those demands is very severe. But that's the part you're not going to see, because then that will alienate the Jewish vote. But, the United States apparently commanded Israel to turn the internet back on. So that suggests that perhaps, weapons deliveries and other things essential to Israel are being held up. Now, but I think it's very clear. Biden is not trying to minimize the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza. The easiest way to do that would be to insist that Egypt, which gets $3 billion of U.S. aid, second biggest aid recipient, completely dependent on it, really.
Guess we're not counting Ukraine right now in that.
We're not counting third biggest. That it open its borders and allow for refugees to flee the conflict. Every single conflict has refugees. Imagine if refugees couldn't flee Ukraine, right? How many casualties there'd be. Imagine if millions of refugees couldn't flee Iraq and Syria. The casualties there would be uncountable. But President Biden has actually said that he supports not a single Gazan should leave.
Yeah, which is, of course, interesting because Egypt doesn't want them doesn't want hundreds of thousands of Arabs entering its borders any more than Israel does.
No, but
for obvious reasons.
But they need not stay in Egypt, or they can only get out through Egypt. But of course, nice countries like Sweden and France, which have strong views about how Israel conducts itself in the conflict, should offer to help the Gazans by accepting them as refugees. They have no problem taking Iraqi refugees, Syrian refugees, Afghan refugees. Why not Palestinian refugees? Why not? It seems specifically that they're keeping them bottled up to reduce Israel's freedom of action.
That's very true. Now, the plight of the Israeli hostages inside Gaza may not have moved much of the world to sympathy, but it has transfixed the Jewish world. If the campaign in Gaza drags on, as we expect it may well, and the hostages are still not freed, only a few have been freed, either released by Hamas and, we're speaking the day after one was apparently rescued. Is it inevitable that this will create public pressure inside Israel on Netanyahu to deal with Hamas as he did in 2011 in the Gilad Shalit deal? Or has October 7th forever forestalled the ability of hostage families to make their loved ones' safety the national priority?
It's a good question. I think nobody really knows. I think there clearly has been a change from October 7th. You don't see Gilad Shalit's parents on the news giving interviews. It's quite clear that freeing that what would be to stop the war, to allow for a hostage swap, would essentially ensure massacres like this over and over. And people sometimes talk about this as the state has a covenant with its citizens, to rescue them. But also, I think part of that covenant is not to recklessly and insanely endanger them. And I think this was Hamas's miscalculation. They thought if one hostage gives us 1,000 people, 200 will give us whatever we want. But there's a discontinuity there. And I think there will be increased pressure, of course. That's the nature of politics. But the Hamas took these hostages for a reason. But I think there's real determination in Israel that, I think you have to try to rescue the hostages as if there's no war, to eliminate Hamas. but try to eliminate Hamas as if there's no hostages.
Yeah, well, that's a balance that probably is not going to work out, but that's something that nobody really wants to think about, because everybody wants the hostages to come out free and safe. But we know the longer the war goes on,
we also don't know how many of the hostages are alive. We don't know. We don't know the most basic thing.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the current struggle is not just one about military strength, about public opinion, in which the plight of Jewish victims was quickly supplanted by that of the Palestinians in Gaza under Israeli fire. President Biden has insisted that most Palestinians have nothing to do with Hamas, and others who don't say that concede that they are victims, but how much sympathy does a population that gives every evidence of supporting terrorism against Jews deserve when a war they started puts them under fire? I mean, that's an interesting question that I don't think certainly Western commentators don't want to touch on. As much as the rules of war obligate Israel to do some things and prevent them to do others, how do Israelis, do you think, now feel about the people of Gaza? Is there that much sympathy for them, and do they deserve any?
I don't think it's a matter of sympathy. I think it's just a matter of being realistic about what's going on there. Certainly support for Hamas is not something which makes one a legitimate target militarily. But there's also the question of what's called moral responsibility, national responsibility. This was how it was put in the terms of Nazi Germany, where, of course, not everyone supported the Nazis, but they had broad support. And this is what the Allies invoked after the war as a moral responsibility, which required Germany to do certain things, pay reparations, make territorial concessions. Hamas has broad support in Gaza. That's quite clear. But I think surveys for going back many years, Palestinian surveys, show that Hamas has majority support. But what's important is that even those who don't support Hamas on a poll, it's not like they don't support Hamas because of their policies against the Jews, right? They don't support them for internal factional reasons. Some might support Islamic Jihad instead, right? So the question on these polls is not, do you support genocide of the Jews, but which of these factions, all of which is committed to that goal amongst varying degrees, do you support? I think the best way to illustrate it is this. Last week, when President Biden was saying that Hamas does not represent Gazans, 300 ostensibly Jewish people burst into the Capitol saying, "Not in our name," against Israel's campaign against, pro-Hamas basically, against Israel's campaign to take out Hamas. Has there been a single not in my name protest about the horrible October 7th massacre in Gaza? No. Has there been a single, what about in the Judea and Samaria under Fatah? They're supposed to be nicer. Has there been a single protest of 10 people shown up? Imagine, this is really what I want your viewers to imagine. Imagine if your country did this. What would be the protest? What would be the reaction by the citizenry? And it's not enough to say, oh, Hamas would shoot them. Right? So in every, totalitarian regime, there are people who are brave and speak up. There was a resistance against Hitler. There were several assassination attempts. Brave people paid with their lives. The Soviet Union was much more absolute in its rule than Hamas. Yet the Hungarians in 56, the Poles in 67, the Czechs in 67, the Poles in the 1980, all rose up against them. They got smushed. But they vindicated their national honor and created a narrative for afterwards where there was someone to talk to. Where is the Gazan Lech Walesa? Where's the Gazan Konrad Adenauer? They don't exist. Or certainly they're keeping very quiet.
Yeah, that's very true. And in fact, I don't really see any protests throughout the Arab and Muslim world in general against this. It seems to have had sort of the opposite. Maybe Hamas calculated correctly. It didn't create a backlash against Hamas. It created an international surge in anti-Semitism.
It was inspirational. That Hamas understood the malleability, the elasticity of the Overton window on genocide far better than anyone could have.
Yeah. Well, given that Hamas is, alas, still alive and well in Gaza, and with Israel's prospects of completely destroying them, at best uncertain, it's certainly premature to discuss what will happen after the war, but that hasn't stopped the United States and others from asserting that a return to a push for a two-state solution must be the next step. But I guess the question is, how can two states solve the problem when Gaza, which is a Palestinian state in all but name since 2007, illustrate what happens when Israel withdraws from territory?
Exactly. I think for pretty much every Israeli across the political spectrum, October 7th was the end of the Palestinian two-state solution. And it's not enough to say, oh, we'll pick different people to run it. The idea is if they have their own state, you don't get to pick who runs it. You might pick the first guy on the first day who runs it, but then what if they don't last? And indeed, Fatah, right? Abbas's party ran it when Israel left. Israel turned over the keys to Abbas, and then they got pushed out of the way by Hamas. And that can happen again, and it can happen again and again. And President Biden likes to say Israel should learn lessons from America's experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, the first lesson is even the mighty United States, after 20 years, left Afghanistan, and boom, Taliban is back the next day. The difference is America is very far from Afghanistan and may not care about the people there. But Israel is right next door. And imagine if Hamas controlled not just Gaza, but Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. Tel Aviv would be kibbutz Be'eri, God forbid.
Yes, I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, basically, two-state solution means replicating Ariel Sharon's Gaza experiment in Judea and Samaria. I mean, it doesn't mean anything else.
With the consequences. And that is why I think the overwhelming consensus in Israel is there cannot be any armed Palestinian force in this region, like ever, for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, well, that continues the conundrum of what do you do with territories that the world won't let you annex, in which maybe you don't want to annex anyway, or at least not everybody does. And you have a lot of people there who don't want to be citizens of Israel. Now, that anomalous situation has continued, for more than 50 years since 1967, but the world still continues to demand a solution. It's considered, a violation of international law.
The solution, the world celebrated when Israel gave up Gaza. Well, this was a step towards the solution, but the solution that is a step to is the final solution.
Right. Yeah, so that's certainly very true. It seems like 10 years ago, but only a few weeks ago, Israelis were seemingly on the brink of civil war over judicial reform, an issue on which you certainly spoke out about. And out-of-control Israeli Supreme Court's decisions on security issues, and especially the maritime deal made by the previous government with Lebanon, wasn't shy about weighing in on any issue before, regardless of the lack of a legal reason to do so. But so far, or at least so far as I know, it hasn't yet tried to get involved in the war against Hamas. But do you believe it is likely that it will attempt to overrule Netanyahu on some pretext or some point before the shooting stops?
I don't think they're going to get involved in the war, per se, for two reasons. First of all, the Supreme Court are very canny politicians, and they know when to choose their moment, and they know this is not the right moment. Secondly, they don't need to. One of the things the Supreme Court did that really expands its power is give veto power over any government action to legal advisors, the Attorney General, and also the legal advisor of every government ministry, military legal advisors, essentially make policy. They say, no, we don't like how you made the rule, make it like this. So currently, the Supreme Court won't even probably get a case because things like rules of engagement and other things are being very heavily shaped even now by government legal advisors, and it's all done behind the scenes. And that's kind of the great democratic deficit that, people don't even know how much of the policy that they see, the output, how much is the elected official and how much is the Attorney General.
Yeah. I guess sort of switching to sort of the U.S.-Israel relationship, on the one hand, it seems to be much closer because of the war. Certainly Biden got the empathy part, very, very strongly, very right, certainly as far as most Jews were concerned. But it has also, sort of metastasized the sort of the intersectional left and its attacks on Israel. You're getting even more anti-Zionist commentary on the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post than even before the war. So where do you see, you're someone obviously has roots in both countries. Where do you see this going? How does this balance? And you noted, Biden's, problems is that he needs liberal Jews. He needs pro-Israel voters because, obviously most Americans are pro-Israel, even if most Democrats aren't necessarily pro-Israel. But he also needs the progressives who are very down on Israel. Where does this go? I mean, it's easy to say, well, if the Republicans get in, Israel will be better off, but we have no idea what will happen in 2024 or how that will play out.
We see a few things. We see that animosity to Israel has a few major sources. One is immigrant communities. So we see Muslim immigrants seem to have a leading role in pro-Hamas protests and so forth. The other is elite institutions, ironically often led by Jews. So presumably, the question is, what's the future? So it depends on immigration policy and it depends on education. Presumably, immigration policy will continue as it is, and the institutions will remain as they are. And the people who come out of these institutions that have a moral equivalence about genocide will be the future White House staffers, will be the future Senate aides. Already there's reports of the young staffers in the White House and in the State Department needing mental health days or crying. These are going to be the future leaders of America, presumably, if America has leaders in the future. This suggests that this is just a taste of what's to come, and it could be bad news for the U.S.-Israel relationship down the road. I think these things can be changed. Right? These institutions can be reformed. These institutions can be defunded, as some philanthropists are beginning to do.
Where do you come down as someone who's, obviously works in the academy, as I say, roots on both, in both sides of the Atlantic, on the question of whether people who engage in basically pro-Hamas, pro-terrorism, statements and demonstrations, whether it's at Harvard or any of the other elite institutions, Columbia, where that goes on. And there's been efforts to sort of, dox them, bring them out, make sure that people don't hire them when they leave. And that's prompted in sort of an ironic backlash from the left, which has been so pro-cancel culture, saying, no, you can't do this, that you're destroying free speech and academic freedom. How does this debate play out when, there is a difference? I would say cancel culture has never been about, is about stifling normal political discourse. It's not been about, canceling people who are Nazis or supporters of genocide. And that's what pro-Hamas commentary is.
So, it is very distressing that it turns out there's a large segment on campus which is pro-genocide. Scary. But, the students, whatever, they're just kids. But the truly distressing thing is how these protests are the reaction of the university administrations. University administrations have DEI policies, right? They're supposed to police microaggressions. Now, I'm not in favor of these policies. But once you say, we will expel you, we will crack down on you if you do anything that makes anyone feel bad, if you just look at them the wrong way, but unless you say that you support the dismemberment of Jews, in which case it's free speech. So that the worst part about it is the discrimination by the university under their own standards, right? That the university essentially created a policy, perhaps an unwise one, but then gives Jews no protection under that policy from threats that are much more extreme. And I think this is the irony of DEI, an ideology within the university, is that when you say that words are violence, which is one of the things they say words that could be a form of violence. When you say words are violence, it turns out you have no words for violence.
That's exactly right. And now there is actual violence and threats of violence being made against Jews on major campuses, whether it's Cornell and, instances, kids getting beaten up.
There's a big question with what can they reconsider? What can they reconsider? Can they reconsider, seeing the New York Times as a major staple of their information diet? Can they reconsider their infatuation with so-called elite institutions? Can they, reconsider their philanthropic giving to cultural and academic institutions, which seem to tolerate the idea of a second Holocaust? I don't know.
Well, I think part of the problem is that there is a large portion of American opinion, basically, the red state half of the country, which is perfectly willing to ignore, to live without the New York Times and disdains sort of the elite institutions. But those who are part of it, we're talking about the vast majority of American Jewry, which worship the New York Times, which, live to send their kids to Ivy League schools, getting them to give this up just because, these schools are now pro-genocide or tolerant of pro-genocide of Jews' opinions, that's a big ask. And I'm not sure that that's something most people are willing to do.
Yeah, we'll see. It's I don't think it's a big ask because it's not ideological. You can not read the New York Times and keep all your liberal persuasions. The point is these are no longer liberal institutions. They have crossed into some crazy medieval Islamist death cult. It's really shocking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think the hold of elite institutions, and certainly in terms of careers and things like that, that's pretty tough. Yes, people can read other things in the New York Times, but if you want, sort of the key to the capital, you do want to go to Harvard and Yale, or Princeton, or or Columbia, So that's something that I would say sort of liberal Jewry will have a much harder time. I habit they'll have a much harder time kicking.
But they should. I would encourage.
Yes,
you can learn a lot in 4 years just by reading books.
Well, that's what I tell my daughter, but we'll see how that works out. Eugene, want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much
for all of your valuable insights. Follow him on Eugene Kontorovich on X or wherever else you are to get a consistent source of important commentary. I also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.